Uncertainties have challenged bilateral relations between the world's two largest economies, China and the United States. After the first virtual meeting between Chinese and American top leaders, there is hope for a stop to the downward spiral and a possible turning point. Although the talk was a good start, how much diplomatic work lies ahead? What more can be done with pragmatic cooperation despite competition? On that, I talked to Susan Thornton again, a senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center for Yale Law School, who was the former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Let's listen in. And I'm very glad and honored to be joined on this discussion on China-U.S. relations by Susan Thornton, Senior Fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center of Yale Law School, former Acting Assistant Secretary of U.S. State Department for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Susan, such a pleasure to see you once again.
Thanks for having me, Tian Wei.
Now, Susan, your takeaway from the first virtual meeting.
Well, I was really pleased, Tian Wei, to see the two leaders being able to meet. Even though it was virtual, it was still, very much a warm meeting. It was a long meeting. There were more lengthy discussions, a lot of preparation. Both sides are paying a lot more attention to maybe the publics at home as opposed to sort of getting into the meat and substance of the diplomacy. Feels to me like there's a lot of public posturing going on in the relationship over the last actually several years, not just in the most recent 10 months under the Biden administration. And I think the meeting was important for trying to start to get away from speaking to each other in the sort of public space and actually do some real diplomacy where you can have a private conversation with another leader, try to talk about concrete things and get things done. And for me, it sort of reestablishes that meeting and communicating between U.S. and Chinese leaders is part of the normal, routine business of international relations. It makes it regular and routine, and I think that's good. We need to get these communication channels reestablished.
In the readouts by both sides, there seems to be not an intention to persuade the other side about exactly what is the nature of this relationship. Earlier, we know there were enormous debates in both sides about this. How do you see this phenomenon?
I think it's probably on purpose that each side is trying to avoid labeling. I know the U.S. side had talked a lot about that earlier on in the beginning of the Biden administration, that they didn't think it was necessary to have a label or a frame for the relationship. They just wanted to try to make sure that we were preparing for this stiff competition and that we would solve problems as they came up. And I think, that was not a very compelling response for the Chinese side, who's now trying to sort of come up with their own way of talking about it that's not competition, obviously.
How to make sure the bureaucracies on both sides will establish relevant communications with one another on some of the points made clear, agreed by both leaders, is an important thing. Now, Susan, you served in the State Department. You also participated in enormous amount of bilateral meetings between China and the United States, sometimes on very crucial and fundamental issues. How do you see the procedure of doing that?
Well, it's very important that the two leaders actually had this meeting so that they can task their officials to go ahead and set up these communication channels, first of all. So they're vested with the authority of the top leadership and their vision for what should be going on. But I think second, there tends to be a bit of a mismatch between the U.S. and China on the degree to which China values the kind of ceremony, the protocol of a major meeting, and the U.S. wants to get right down to solving the problem and talking about specifics. And I think you do see that kind of mismatch happening over and over and over again in the China-U.S. relationship. But, without getting these kinds of conversations started, we can't start to solve these problems. And so I hope they'll be able to set them up at in a fairly low profile way, but sooner, I think, is better.
How resilient do you think the result of and takeaway of this virtual meeting will be in enduring some of the ups and downs and challenges of this relationship, which has been there for quite some time?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the two leaders, they know each other from previous encounters, of course, going back decades. They do have a more familiarity with one another than other leaders have had, but it's still hard in the US-China relationship to keep any momentum going for very long, especially if something knocks us off course. And there's always things to knock us off course. The most recent big thing to knock us off course, and it's relevant here, is the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is contributing to this problem of lack of communication between the two sides. I imagine that the Biden administration without COVID might have come in and started some communications a little bit earlier, but was unable to do that, of course. And so it's still a factor going forward to see how often we're going to be able to meet in person coming through this winter. And I think, you know, that's really important. Those personal communications, visits, face-to-face meetings are very important.
China has been having some challenges in understanding the sincerity coming from this administration about the China-U.S. relations. How should we judge the sincerities from both sides in terms of delivering the results of the meeting?
Well, this is where I think you have to look at the things that were said in the meeting. And I think Joe Biden did make a number of statements in the meeting that were meant to be reassuring to China on many of these fronts. But you also have to look at the actions that are going to follow the meeting and see how the things that were said are going to be actually put into practice following up on the meeting. And I think that's really where the kind of mistrust or suspicion is going to be ameliorated, in seeing whether this meeting can actually lead to a tamping down of some of the very public recriminations that we've seen on a lot of these issues, and also a kind of a toning down of some of the language in public that has been, I think, difficult for both sides to handle given the domestic politics around the relationship. So, you know, we'll see if, I mean, this is why I think the meeting was good, but it's still a test, and we need to keep testing as we're going forward. We're not, you know, as one of my Chinese colleagues said the other day, there's no silver bullet for US-China relations.
Both sides, after decades of having very close interaction and grow together, both have tools to damage this relationship directly, fast. We've seen that being demonstrated over the past few years. Now, how much do you think both sides now understand that there are tools that they can use for negotiations and for things to happen to a better place as they plan? But there are tools that they really cannot pick up because that's going to really hurt the fundamentals of this relationship. Do you think both sides understand that now?
I think there are some people on both sides that do understand that. I'm not sure everyone understands that. And I do worry about this because we tend to have gotten pretty impatient about our diplomacy, about our negotiations. You know, these things take a long time to come to fruition. And it feels to me like we've become, you know, a bit disillusioned or disenchanted with the kind of hard work that goes into reaching an agreement through, you know, just diplomatic work, diplomatic efforts. And sometimes people want to reach for a big stick as a tool that they think that can sort of stir things up and get a solution. And that doesn't tend to bring a lot of progress in my experience.
Then before we go, last question and quick answer, hopefully, that, you know, we have this virtual meeting after more than a year, after 10 months since the Biden came into the office. What's next to you? If you were in the State Department, if you were still serving this administration, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think that they will try to set up a number of these communication channels. We need to get a security dialogue going. I hope it will be consisting of military and diplomatic officials. I think the trade discussion should continue. We need a conversation about managing the pandemic economic recovery, and also more on transnational issues like climate change and global health. If we can get all of those strands of communication going, I'm pretty sure we will be able to come up with some concrete outcomes that can put some actions onto the words from the meeting. And that's the direction that I hope we would be going in.
Susan Thornton, as always, thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your thoughts and insights with us.